I've read so many books about dictators and authoritarianism over the last several years that I find it's a very high hill to climb to re-engage with some of these books. And I finished reading Gideon's book recently, and it is such an important, elegant, and sophisticated book. I can't recommend it more highly to all of you. Gideon's not paying me to say that, and I say it with great admiration and respect for Gideon's longstanding body of work, but especially for this book. And Gideon had the good fortune to write about dictators right as Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, making the book even more topical, unfortunately more topical. It's a series of profiles of a number of authoritarian leaders, and we could probably spend 2 or 3 hours sitting here talking about them. But we'll try to be more concise. In the beginning of your book, in the prologue, you said that this book will attempt to answer 3 central questions about the age of the strongman. When did the strongman tendency take hold? What are its main characteristics? And why did it happen? All of those kind of come together in the great why of what's happening in this era we're in. I think authoritarian leaders are one of the great existential crises of our time, along with COVID and climate change. So you've got a big question to answer here, Gideon. Why did this happen? Why now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Literary Festival for having me here and for the very generous introduction. And Tim, thanks for taking the time on a weeknight to talk to me. Well, in a way, that's the most difficult question of all. The when the chronology you can state, but why it happened. I don't think you can say there's a single explanation. But broadly speaking, I would look at 4 characteristics, and I should say one of the arguments of the book is that this is a truly global phenomenon. That it starts with Putin in 2000. In 2000, he comes to power actually on the first day of the 21st century, which is unfortunately symbolic. You then have Erdoğan in Turkey, Xi Jinping in China, Modi in India. I don't need to tell you about what happened here in 2016, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on. So that by 2018, if you looked at the UN Security Council, you have Russia, China, the United States, all in sort of different forms of strongman leadership. India, the second most populous country in the world with Modi, and Brazil, the most populous country in Latin America. It's quite a roll call. So you have to say, well, what is going on? What's driving it? And in some ways, it's hard to come up with, because these are very different societies. Clearly something global is going on, but pinning it down is tricky. So let me give you 4 broad themes there. I think one is economic. The second I'd call kind of social cultural, linked particularly to migration and feelings about minority groups. The third would be technological, and the fourth would be emulation. On the economic front, I think that these leaders typically appeal to the discontented, people who feel that they've suffered particularly in the West, people who feel they're the losers from globalization. You saw that obviously with Trump. He wins particularly well outside the big cities, with the whole slogan about "Make America Great Again" is a slogan about national decline, which is often interpreted economically. But it's not solely a Trumpian US-based phenomenon. I mean, if you look at my own country, and there's a chapter on Brexit in there, the profile of the Brexit vote and the Trump voter are very similar. And Fiona Hill, the very clever woman who worked for Trump briefly, and then testified in the impeachment hearings, but she's a Russia specialist, and she actually saw the people who voted for Putin, not voted for Putin, well, I guess they did, but, in a rigged election, but the base of support for Putin, similarly in the deindustrialized areas of Russia, and drew a kind of link between her own background in the deprived bit of England with the Midwest of the US and the Rust Belt of Russia. There were similar things going on.
But haven't there always been people feeling like they've been left out of the party? Isn't that as old as the sun?
It is, which is why I think you need other things as well. I think probably just a footnote on that, something quite extreme was going on in some of these countries. I mean, one of the things that perhaps should have set off alarm bells here was when the life expectancy of uneducated white men, non-college educated white men, began to fall, which was something that you had seen in Russia in the 1990s, related to severe economic dislocation. So I don't think this was just bad times as usual. But I think that, yeah, economic deprivation isn't enough. I think it's often particularly potent for these strongman leaders when they can harness that kind of anger and link it to a sense that something unfair has happened, and often that unfairness is that your group is being discriminated against, which means that it's often linked to migration or to feelings about minorities. So that, of course, again, here in the US, Trump signature act, build the wall, the attempt to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. And I think it's when you link a sense of economic deprivation with a sense of cultural threat, then you're kind of in business. And this is very, very common, this stirring up discontent or upset about minorities. So if you look at Hungary, there's a chapter about Viktor Orbán there. He really becomes a global figure, and incidentally then a figure who's kind of lionized by the American right in a slightly strange way, given he leads a country of only 10 million people. But his signature issue is when he leads the kind of revolt against migration from the Muslim world coming into Europe, builds a wall, in fact. And that makes him really a Europe-wide and then almost a global figure. But the same in India, Modi's kind of signature issue is anti-Muslim sentiment. He's not so much an Indian nationalist as a Hindu nationalist. And in China, they interned more than 1 million Muslims. I mean, Muslims are often the outgroup who are targeted in this scenario.
But they're able to take that witch's brew of white nationalism in the U.S., for example, yeah, ultra nationalism in other countries, racism, and resentment, and ignite it on social media, right? Isn't social media one of the real distinguishing factors in all of this, because it allows them to get a message directly out to their supporters, to identify where those supporters are, and as a tool that hasn't really been at the fingertips of dictators before.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, so I said technological was the third thing, and I think that is, I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of this happens just as social media is coming in, because it gives these leaders a very direct way of communicating with their followers. And on Twitter you have followers. And it's a medium that is very tailored to appeals to the gut, to emotional appeals. And it's not fact-checked because it's direct. It's between the person posting on Facebook or posting on Twitter and the people who are drawn into this message. And I think a lot of these leaders are very, very adept users of social media. Trump and Twitter is an obvious example, but Duterte in the Philippines, who was elected the same year as Trump, was one of the first leaders to really put out fake news on Facebook. And later, Filipino analysts, or possibly it was actually Facebook themselves, called Philippines patient zero, because it was the first election where you could see the weaponization of Facebook to whip up following for a strongman leader. And Duterte was putting out incredibly brutal messages, and indeed followed very brutal policies about simply unleashing death squads on suspected drug dealers, and did so, within days of coming to office. There was a real bloodbath in the Philippines. Bolsonaro in Brazil is another who is, constantly tweeting to his followers, and this allows them to bypass boring people like me and you, who will write an article in the paper saying, this isn't actually true or something. It doesn't really matter once you're out there on social media. I think it's quite...
And also their broader political opposition really, I think, ignored or underplayed what a strong tool this was for both acquiring and solidifying power.
Yeah, I think that it is the case that maybe because these are people who position themselves as anti-establishment politicians, they're often quite innovative in the way that they think, but in some ways it's... obviously the opposition will use social media as well, but perhaps because these are leaders who specialize in these super emotive messages, they're particularly effective users of social media, because we know what goes viral on social media. It's things that shock and appall, or it's not a sort of rational, balanced on the one hand, on the other hand message. And I do think the social media companies have something to answer for. I mean, I was quite struck when I visited Facebook a couple of years ago, and they were talking about how they had, for example, advised the BJP, Modi's party, on how to use Facebook. And they, as they put it, well, they,
right at the same time as they were trying to expand their business in India.
Yes.
What a coincidence.
Enough, yeah. But they said, well, he's a client, it's client services. We like to show people, Facebook users, how to effectively use the medium. But this was a guy who was really weaponizing it. And Indian Twitter, not unlike, other Twitter, is full of really violent, hate-filled messages. And Facebook the same.
So we've hit on economic dislocation, nationalism/racism, social media, fourth factor?
Well, I think emulation. I mean, I don't think you should underestimate the extent to which there are fashions in politics as well as in, everything else. And so when Putin, for example, comes to power in 2000, at that point, none of, obviously strongman leaders have been around all over the place, but at that point, none of the major powers really had a leader of that sort. China had moved away from it after the death of Mao. The tradition in Russia after Stalin was like a collective communist party leadership rather than a personality cult. And obviously, we thought this style of leadership was alien to the West. And when Putin first comes in, he sort of, at least for an international audience, plays the role of a liberal Democrat. He starts.
And you actually see Putin as sort of the architect,
yeah,
the prime or the first mover, at least, in this modern.
Yeah, and we probably fail. A lot of Western analysts failed to see what was going on because we were also. This was the era when he came to power, maximum Western self-confidence. Year before 9/11 and so on. 10 years after Fukuyama's written The End of History. So we kind of screen out the fact that he's doing something else to some extent. And then when it becomes clear that he is a sort of violent, an authoritarian leader, for a while he looks like an anomaly. Angela Merkel says, oh well, he's a 19th century figure in the 21st century. He's not really, they're not going to be others like that, surely. But it turns out that there are, and I went through the list. There's Erdoğan in 2003, and Xi Jinping in 2012, and so on. And
there was a lot of wishful thinking about Xi.
Totally, yeah.
And now we're talking about perhaps a new Cold War between the U.S. and China.
Completely. I mean, again, if you look at a lot of Western commentary, when both Xi and Erdogan comes to power, we're still applying our own ideological lens to them and saying, oh, they'll obviously kind of liberalize economically and politically because that's what these leaders are, that's what you have to do, surely, to be successful. But in fact, Putin was sort of creating an alternative model, which was this macho, authoritarian, culturally conservative, highly nationalistic, illiberal, and anti-democratic. Now, some of these countries were not, you'd say, well, China was never a democracy anyway, so what are you talking about? But actually, there had been a debate before Xi comes to power about, well, maybe China would start to move towards a kind of liberalization. If not elections, they would set up independent courts. Some of the attributes of a liberal society. And one of the first things Xi does is give a speech saying, we're not doing that. Be absolutely clear on that. And he also links this to the collapse of the Soviet Union. He has a similar view to Putin, that this was a disaster, and that the Communist Party should absolutely have maintained control. And so these leaders kind of learn from each other. They learn imagery, but they also kind of pick the same enemies. Like George Soros suddenly becomes, who as you know, is singled out here by the American right, but also by Erdogan in Turkey, by Orbán in Hungary, by Putin in Russia. He becomes this.
Anti-Semitism works everywhere.
It does, yeah. No, I think it's obviously it's the fact that he's Jewish is part of it, but I don't think it varies society to society. But I don't think it's the only thing. It's also the values that he funds a lot of minority groups. He funds
and civil advocacy.
Absolutely, yeah. So the first place he gets shut down is Russia, and that's because he's funding independent media, he's funding groups that protect minorities, and he's funding a society called Memorial, which was looking into the history of Stalinism, which actually Putin has finally closed definitively in the last year. But it's that kind of dissident stuff that these leaders don't like. And I've been thinking about it, you know, I feel particularly strongly about it this week because just a couple of weeks ago, a good Turkish friend of mine called Hakan Altanay, who was the head of the Open Society Foundation in Turkey, was in prison for 18 years, you know, on completely trumped up conspiratorial charges. So, you know, it's worth remembering that, you know, Strongman sounds kind of abstract, etc., or like it's about imagery, but in the end it's about direct oppression.
So into this swirl of sort of Putinism steps Donald Trump,
Yeah.
who I think in your book, as I read it, you see him as sort of an aficionado or a student of these people, and then he becomes the teacher in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, you've written books about Trump, you know a great deal about it. But I was very struck reading that famous article or interview with Playboy in 1991, you know, which was sort of Trump's Das Kapital, but it was happened to be an interview with Playboy, but where he sets out his ideas for the first time, how incredibly authoritarian he is. I mean, this is just after the Tiananmen Square massacre, and he says what's not, you know, a fashionable view in the West at the time, that the Chinese had done the right thing. He says, you know, they were very tough, but they had to do it, you know. He also speaks, he says what an idiot Gorbachev is for reforming. In fact, he is rather prescient. He says that, you know, the Soviet, he's going to cause that country to collapse. But he obviously thought that was a bad thing. And so Trump's authoritarianism or admiration for authoritarian leaders was there from the very, very beginning. And he's quite frank about it in office. I mean, we were talking about the Bob Woodward book before. He says to Bob Woodward, the tougher and meaner they are, the more I like them, in the context of Erdoğan. The leaders that he gets on very badly with are women, sort of Democrats like Merkel, you know, or Hillary Clinton. An
affinity he has for mobsters, by the way, as well as dictators.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and it's right up to the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, 2 days before the invasion of Ukraine, he is calling Putin a genius.
Talk a little bit about Trump's performance art and how that's had a broader echo globally in terms of, you know, how he's ignited this, I think, in a way that even Putin hadn't.
Yeah, no, because obviously, I mean, so one of the interesting things for me, as you know what it's like, you write a book, you kind of figure it out partly as you go along, you see patterns, and it struck me that we're so used to seeing the US as the pioneer in things, that it was interesting to see that actually a lot of the strongman trend was already quite well established globally when Trump comes to the party, so to speak. But obviously, because of the unique cultural and political power of America, for the American president to be a leader of this style has a huge global impact. And Trump provides a lot of these leaders with a vocabulary, like his favorite tag of fake news. That then gets adopted by, you know, they all start saying anything they don't like is fake news. Bolsonaro is a particular Trump acolyte devotee, becomes known as the Trump of the tropics. And really, if you look at the kinds of things Bolsonaro said, it's a kind of straight rip-off of Trump. You know, it's all about fake news.
Orbán as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Orbán adopts these things. And as I said, you know, the kind of the Soros meme is one that they all pick up from each other. But Trump, I mean, actually it had been going in the Republican Party well before Trump came along, but he also picks up on it. And the whole rhetoric of strength, the kind of the love of military parades, all of that kind of gets validated because if even the US president is like this, well, that's obviously the wave of the future. And Orbán says this rather sinister thing where he says, we used to think the European Union was our future, and now we know we're the future of the European Union. But what he means by that is that the liberal values embodied by the EU are going to have to give way to illiberal values. And one of the reasons that he is so confident when he says this is because, well, look at the US. This is clearly the wave of the future.
In 2008, the United States had both a financial crisis and we elected a black president for the first time. If the U.S. hadn't had a financial crisis or a black president, would we still have had Donald Trump?
You know, hard to do these counterfactuals, but I think you're right. Those were both very, very important events. I mean, the first because it's along with the Iraq War, I would say, is a very elite discrediting event. So that a lot of the rhetoric of Trump, but of all these strongman leaders really, is that the elite don't know what they're doing, don't trust them, they're working against you, and they have good raw material when you have a disastrous war on a kind of false premise, essentially, and then an economic crisis where people can say, well, these people are meant to know what they're doing, and they've created this thing. So that's kind of excellent raw material, which allows them. And then as we talked about the politics of white nationalism and cultural resentment, obviously, Obama's election stirs up a lot of those fears. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first kind of lie conspiracy theory that Trump propagates is that Obama's not born in the United States. So it's a way of saying he's not a legitimate president. I wonder why, he strikes you as un-American in some way.
And so then Trump goes about peeling back all these myths Americans have told themselves for decades about racial progress and economic equality.
No, I have to say that demonic in some ways as Trump is, he's got an incredible political instinct. He had a sense of what he could say that you and I would think, well, obviously any political leader that does that is going to be finished. And how many times did you hear, well, he's gone too far now? Whether it was, the first time I remember thinking that was when he said John McCain's not a war hero, and I thought, wow, this is such a deeply patriotic country, he's a revered figure, obviously that will damage him hugely in the Republican Party, they won't have that. Well, I was wrong about that, and then he does it again and again and again. Well, obviously you can't say you'd ban all Muslims from the US, but he takes America to places where people thought they wouldn't go, but he kind of knows that there's a constituency out there for it.
What then must be done? We're approaching a midterm election in which, if we believe in polls, the Democrats are going to do poorly. There's a chance that Trump comes back into the White House in 2024. You end your book optimistically, though your optimism is one that spans centuries. Yes, at least decades. You say that strong men step on themselves over time, essentially, and if you just wait, that will happen. But waiting is a long time, and in the long run, we're all dead. So what is the response to this phenomenon in the U.S. and globally when we have such an existential, grotesque threat staring us right in the face?
Well, I think partly it is to be aware of the threat. That I think that one of the reasons that the US was vulnerable, and to a lesser extent, I wouldn't put Brexit in the same category of like threat to democracy, but it was a pretty wrenching event for the UK, was that that we spent a lot of time telling ourselves it wouldn't happen here, and if you believe your own myth, you become a little bit vulnerable. So I think you have to be vigilant. I think you have to be very protective of institutions, because in the end, although we'll see what happens next time around, because it was very close, January the 6th, too close for comfort, but American institutions did withstand the test, and the fact that America had independent institutions that weren't yet under the control of the strongman was critical. And the countries that where it's really impossible to get rid of these people or without violence or a coup of some description are places like Russia and China, where all the independent institutions have been broken down. So be very zealous of protecting the media, protecting the courts. I think it's a bad sign for America that the Supreme Court is now regarded as a highly politicized institution, because it should be this thing that's above politics. So those things, but I think there's also a kind of bunch of interesting, difficult dilemmas for people of a kind of liberal disposition, which is, to what extent do you meet the angry populist voters, if you want to call that, halfway? And say, well, if we just stick to our own script, we're going to lose. And I'm thinking particularly of migration, where there is obviously a concern in many societies about what is perceived as uncontrolled migration, about demographic change that it brings with it. The solutions to those are to stopping them are often pretty brutal, and maybe they're not even solutions, but there's a demand for them. And to take non-American examples, you have countries like Denmark, which is regarded, as very liberal, Scandinavian, etc. They've adopted unbelievably draconian policies to try to stem the flow of migration because they felt otherwise the far right were going to come to power. In Australia, the same. They take asylum seekers and just put them offshore on an island hundreds of miles away in internment camps. And obviously here in the US, you've got the question of the southern border, and Obama was splitting up families as well.
But this is an issue that also goes well beyond immigration. It gets into so many public policy issues. And I think, getting back to the whole issue of social media, the right is willing to lie and propagandize, at least in the U.S., in a way that the left is not.
No,
And
they don't have I was just thinking about this because I was just in Washington and I was talking to a senior Democrat and I was saying, why hasn't Trump been prosecuted for, or, isn't there more of an effort over January the 6th? I mean, he was basically trying to encourage...
He broke the law.
Yeah, he was trying to encourage a coup. And this guy said to me, well, it would be very divisive if we tried that. And I said, well, America looks pretty divided already. And the thing is that he wouldn't hesitate to do that to you. Be the first thing he did, is try to put his opponents in prison. So if we sort of sit saying, got to tread carefully, if you actually are within the law, I would think
I mean, look at their attorney generals, Bill Barr compared to Merrick Garland. Bill Barr operated like a street thug.
Yeah.
And Merrick Garland is, I think, honorably concerned about not appearing to be partisan, but in the process of wanting to appear not to be partisan, he's not prosecuting people who broke the law.
Oh.
Should we turn over?
Oh, I'm just not holding my microphone close enough. Sorry. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Take the point.
Okay. And I sort of think Bill Barr versus Merrick Garland is emblematic of some of the problems that I think liberals, progressives / left have in responding to the willingness of conservatives and the far right to engage in thuggery and racism and the like.
Yeah, and and I'm not saying it's unproblematic because obviously you don't want to become the thing you're fighting against, but I think
that's the slippery slope, isn't it?
Yeah, but you have to, I think, also be tough. As Trump would say, you got to be tough. So.
But in that context, what is tough? That still feels to me like, that the response to this is awaiting a blueprint.
Sorry,
the response to this phenomenon is still waiting a blueprint.
I agree. We're all thrashing around a bit, and it will vary country by country. But one thing I would say is that in those countries that are still fortunate enough to have elections, not China, not Russia, which has rigged elections, it's been quite striking. The few examples of strongmen kind of losing power have tended, or at least being threatened by elections, is when the opposition really, really unites. So that I would put...
Israel's a good example in your book, right?
Yeah, Netanyahu, who I think, is to some extent a strongman figure. He certainly identifies both with Orbán strongly and with Trump. And interestingly, at Bolsonaro's inauguration, the two guests of honor are Netanyahu and Orbán. But in the end, every opposition party in Israel came together, stretching from the Muslim Brotherhood to the far-right settlers, to form a coalition that gave them a majority of one, that got Netanyahu out. Now, it may not be permanent, he could be back, but it showed that, if enough people realize the threat that this ruler poses to the system, and they get then they can unite around that. And something similar is happening in Turkey, where it looks like there'll be a very, very broad opposition coalition to oppose Erdoğan in the next election. I mean, it doesn't always work. There was a very broad opposition coalition in Hungary, and it just lost. But it's probably your best hope.
Should we turn some questions? I could hog Gideon all night. But would you like to turn some questions over to our guests? Okay.
We can share, yeah.
Yeah. Any questions?
I would like to know about the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Trump. Like, there's a recent article saying Jared Kushner got like $2 billion for Saudi Arabia for an investment fund. That's kind of sketchy, isn't it? I mean, shouldn't that be like investigated?
Well, I mean, you know, I agree. I mean, I think you're right. It's a very, in fact, there's a bit in the book about it. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman is a very interesting figure, both sort of geopolitically and also as an example of the strongman phenomenon, because one of the things I try to say is that even in countries that are already authoritarian, there's been a move towards a more personalized rule. And he is an example of that. You know, who really could put a face to the Saudi ruler before? And it was a kind of royal family and collective. And then he comes in, starts imprisoning his relatives, as we know, murdering journalists, and creates a cult of personality. And he makes this connection with Jared Kushner. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that Trump's first big foreign visit is to Saudi Arabia. There is a very, there's a special relationship between the Saudis and between MBS and Kushner in particular. Now, they would argue that it was put to some good use because there was the whole Abraham Accords, peace deal. I mean, as I said, Netanyahu was also close to Kushner, so close that I believe he stayed in the family house. And there's this sort of strange WhatsApp relationship going on between Kushner and MBS and Netanyahu. And I mean, the Saudis are noted for one thing, as having vast sums of money. It is quite striking, as you say, that this deal has come in. I mean, you know, I'm sure they will make sure to make it look as above board as possible. And, you know, unless you could prove a direct payoff, you know, this was done for that. But it does look like a massive conflict of interest, absolutely.
Hi, thank you for coming here. It's very interesting. I'm wondering, your book probably doesn't touch on this because it's just happening right now with the war in Ukraine and Biden basically actually getting liberal Western democracies together to fight fascism and authoritarianism through Putin. Like, how do you see this playing out in the future when you're talking about authoritarianism taking over the world, and now there seems to be at least some attempt to push back? Yeah,
no, I agree. I mean, I think it's an incredibly important moment. You know, it's funny, I was writing the afterword of the book, the very last bit in December, just as people were saying, you know what, he might be about to invade Ukraine. So I have a slightly guarded reference to this mysterious buildup of troops. But no, I think it is. We were saying what brings this to a close, and the best I could come up with is that strongman rule is a very flawed model, and eventually these leaders, even the relatively competent ones, will make some kind of catastrophic error that might bring their period to a close. And I think we may be seeing that with Putin right now. Obviously, he believed that this would all be over in a few days, that they would just be able to walk into Kiev. He's now bogged down in a war that looks unwinnable, and the Russians have taken very heavy casualties. So, put it this way, had he been right and won in about 3 or 4 days, it would have had a disastrous effect beyond the region, because I think it would have been a further validation of the strongman style of politics. I mean, we were talking earlier about the cult of Putin, and one of the reasons that people like Rudy Giuliani, or in my own country, Nigel Farage, go on the record in recent years and say, you know, this guy's a real leader, is because he had used military force quite effectively in Syria. I think Giuliani said that's what you call real leadership, you know, the way he just marched. The US had hesitated, he gets in there. And if he had won in Ukraine, everybody would have said, ha-ha, as Trump had said before, another example of Putin's genius. This is what you get if you have a proper strongman leader prepared to break the rules. So if, in fact, it goes the other way, and he makes a terrible mess, he fails, then at least this model, this idea is discredited. And I think the risk, if it succeeded, would be that it would have put up thoughts in a lot of these other leaders' heads that maybe military action and annexation's back on the menu for international leaders, that you would have seen China much more willing, say, to attack Taiwan. Because also this is about, can America stop these leaders? Is it willing to? Does it have the ability to? If America, after Afghanistan, 6 months later, you get Ukraine going in 3 or 4 days, then I think it's kind of open season for a lot of these leaders around the world to say, okay, the American policeman's totally ineffective, military force works really well, let's go for it. But if the opposite happens, the opposite message is sent out. And I think that Biden has capitalized quite well on the opportunity given to him by the fact that this Russian military intervention has gone badly, and has built quite an effective coalition. But I think a footnote is it's worth noticing that this coalition is pretty well confined to the West, really. That if you look at the countries that abstained at the UN, they include India, not just China, Brazil, and Mexico, South Africa, and a lot of these countries not coincidentally led by their own strongman leaders, by Bolsonaro, Saudis also abstained. So they're not giving up on Putin just yet.
Any other questions?
Good evening, and thank you for being with us. This may be off your beat a drop, but I'm reminded that Hamas took over power in Gaza through an election, and you spoke earlier about Merrick Garland in terms of democratic processes, small d democratic, in terms of closer adherence to the rule of law, not overstepping, whatever those narrower view of how aggressively to pursue the January 6th. So I'm just saying, can democracy survive democracy? I mean, are we going to... That's what I want to know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that one of the interesting things about a lot of these leaders is they are elected. That's true of Orbán, it's true of Modi, Trump, obviously, Bolsonaro. And, fair enough, their voters are allowed to vote for who they like. The only objection is if they then begin to undermine the system so that they stay in power forever, or they damage the system. And I think it's not coincidental, incidentally, that a lot of these leaders begin to abolish term limits in whatever system they're in. So Erdoğan has done it in Turkey, Putin has done it in Russia, Xi has done it in China. Actually, they did have term limits on the Chinese presidency, and they've been abolished. And those kinds of erosion of the democratic institutions that make it possible for the people to say, you know what, this hasn't worked out so well, we're going to try something else. That's the sort of danger sign. And I'm afraid, obviously it's much easier in a society with very weak democratic traditions. You mentioned the Gaza Strip. Well, obviously it's not been a functioning democracy, but I think one of the things that is quite alarming is that it's, you can see that kind of assault happening even in an established old democracy like the United States.
I wonder, do you think the level of corruption in a given society has an impact on whether that authoritarian system will survive?
I think the relationship between these strongmen and corruption is a very interesting one, because one of the things, they often massively enrich themselves. Not all of them, but by and large, that tends to be part of the package. And it's obviously a contradiction with the general pitch that they're men of the people, and that they represent the people that, Putin is sometimes described as the world's richest man. I'm not even sure what that really means, but he's got a lot of money. Erdoğan similarly, and you can see family members being brought into the government or getting contracts. That was one of the raps on Orbán. His son-in-law, suddenly being given all these public works contracts and so on. So yeah, corruption is very closely related to it, but it's also a way of keeping in power, because you buy off groups of people. And I think it's also one of the reasons that they are reluctant to give up power as well, because if you've essentially committed crimes, it's very dangerous to give up power, because, and not just for you, incidentally, for all the people you've enriched who are part of the system. So that discussing with friends who follow Russia why there was such a panic, not just from Putin, but within Putin's circle to keep him there, was because a whole network of people had been enriched by sort of dirty deals from like the forced takeover of Yukos, which was billions were stolen essentially. And there have been court judgments outside Russia saying this was theft. Now, if a new Russian president came in and enforced the Yukos judgment, a lot of people would lose their fortunes. So there's a whole network that says, you stay there, we don't want change. And that's sort of what happens when you have a corrupt society. That's not just the leader who has interests, but the network of corruption around him, whose liberty is at stake as well as their fortune.
Good evening. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about China and Xi Jinping, because China's been a totalitarian state, at least since Mao, arguably forever, with various degrees of strongman leader. And there was no economic impetus. I mean, the Chinese economy was continuing to grow. So what do you think are the particular causes for his rise?
Well, I mean, I think that it'd be interesting. I'm not sure that the Chinese Communist Party knew exactly what they were getting. He was regarded as almost the establishment candidate. There was a populist, dangerous figure, a guy called Bo Xilai, who was the one saying we need a revival of Maoism and so on. But he was arrested just like a few months before the vital Congress, and Xi gets a clear run. But then when he comes in, quite quickly, he does these things like beginning to establish a personality cult, getting Xi Jinping thought written into the constitution, abolishing presidential term limits, and really moves China from what was obviously not a liberal democracy, but in an even more authoritarian, even more personalized way, dashing the expectations of those liberals, both in China and outside, who had hoped that gradually they would move in the opposite direction. And I think it's a reflection of his view of how China should be run, which he's quite explicit about. In his first year, he gets a film distributed to senior members of the Communist Party about the downfall of the Soviet Union as a warning, and says, the reason this happened was that the party crumbled and it led to a breakup of a great country, and we must never do this. And the reason that Russia took the wrong path was they began to listen to the West on issues like media freedom, on issues like independence of the courts. Don't do this. He has a deep belief, self-serving belief, but probably also genuine, that China's unity, China's progress requires the leadership of the Communist Party, and that any efforts to democratize are a kind of Western plot to undermine China. And that's the direction it takes him. But then whether this requires the personalization, I'm not so sure. But it kind of comes back to the corruption thing, because one of the things that he does is launch a massive anti-corruption drive. And up to 1 million people are arrested in the course of this. And that then creates, presumably, a bunch of people who have a grudge against Xi Jinping, which then makes it harder for him to step down and so on. And I assume, like a lot of these leaders, he rather likes being the leader and so doesn't want to step down. But the interesting thing is, he looked like, this is a vital year for him and for China, because having rolled back the term limits, this November they have a party congress where he is likely to be reappointed as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and then, a couple of months later as president, sort of allowing him to rule really more or less till he dies, I think. And it was all going pretty smoothly. He was using COVID and China's apparent success in suppressing COVID, as opposed to 1 million deaths in the United States, as an example of, well, I told you, the Chinese system is superior, and that's the message that they bang out every day. But now it's gone really, really badly wrong, because the zero COVID policy has led to a lockdown in Shanghai, which is very undercovered in the West, partly because of the Ukraine war, partly because so many foreigners have left China. But it's extraordinary what's going on there. Yeah. Beijing not fully yet, but if it goes to Beijing, they're in real trouble. 25 million people essentially not allowed to leave their homes for 5 weeks, reliant on government food deliveries and so on. And they're now, they've tightened it. I've deliberately sort of done Zoom calls with friends in Shanghai over the last few weeks just to kind of get a sense of what is going on. And they were saying, hopefully, a couple of weeks ago, well, we're coming to the end now. It's, it's beginning to be relaxed. On the contrary, it's being tightened. And it just seems to me, the kind of crazy policy that a strongman leader, without a checks and balances, who people won't say no to, will indulge in. And if there's really no exit for Shanghai, and then if, as you say, it spreads to Beijing, surely it has to raise some question mark over whether Xi has failed, and really at exactly the wrong time. Now, people say, oh, he'll be reappointed, but often these are the same people who said he desperately needs months of stability and peace ahead of the party congress. So that implies to me that there must be a question as to whether, he will be reappointed. But the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party are deeply mysterious. So, similarly with Bo Xilai, you suddenly get this arrest and you realize something's been going on. But until it happens, you don't really know.
No pressure. I had a question about the press, and as you went from country to country, did you come to any conclusions about, well, when the press does this, it's good, when the press does that, it's bad? The countries that have not had strongmen, do they have healthier practices in the press, or is the press just sort of dependent on trends in society, about the health of society in general?
Sorry, could you just say it again? Slightly.
Well, just what's the role of the press?
The press, yeah.
And even in doing your book, did you think gosh, well, the conventions I'm used to in my day job aren't really up to task, or gosh, the conventions I've been trained in my whole career are fine. It's just people got to listen. A lot of questions about the press.
Yeah, no, I think it's one thing that's very striking is that in those countries that have a free press, one of the first things they try to do is control it. So we talked about how social media allows them to bypass the press or to discredit the mainstream media, and that is one route for these people. But they tend not to like a free press, and if they can control it, they will. So, in Hungary, essentially, Orbán there really isn't much left by the way of independent media. The same with Russia. And interestingly, the first oligarchs that Putin goes after are the ones with media interests. They're, Berezovsky and so on, Kaczynski are people who are forced out quite quickly. And in Turkey, there are so many journalists in prison. It's just horrifying. So, yeah, it's a classic dictatorial instinct, is you don't want a free press. Now, as Trump has shown, you can, even if you do have a free press, there are things you can do about it, other ways of getting your message across. But I wouldn't imagine that, if he had his complete way, that the free press would be in very good health by the end of it.
Well, isn't the press sort of confronted with the same institutional problem that law enforcement is in these scenarios, which is sometimes doing what is right runs against the conventions that you've observed for a long time about appearing to be neutral.
Yeah, I know. I've never been sure about this. I was a bit shocked when people began to call Trump a liar in news reports. That didn't sound right to me. because that's not the way we do it. And I still think that you have to try to, if it's the other side that despite what Trump says, specializes in fake news, that distorts things, that you should stick to professional standards. And one of those professional standards should be seen to be trying to be fair, to give people the right of reply. And so that is part of democracy, which is not, but I think that is combinable with tough reporting, where you do get to the bottom of things, such as, for example, Jared Kushner's loan from Saudi Arabia. That's the kind of thing that really should be reported upon. What I don't think you should do is, to my mind, slide into wild, outright partisanship, partly because these are all politicians that thrive on division. They are politicians that specialize in friend-enemy. They create an enemy group and a friend group. And a highly polarized press is useful to them in that sense that it whips up society, creates the kind of anger that they thrive on. Whereas, ideally, one should have a more calming, rational debate. I was talking to somebody today who was trying to... do you remember the old television program Crossfire? They're trying to create a podcast called Ceasefire, in which you actually have a conservative and a liberal trying to have a rational discussion.
Those are people on my team, actually.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I thought it was a very striking idea. And that is,
We'll see if it works.
Civil discourse is something one should be trying to encourage.
Gideon Rachman, thank you for joining us all tonight.